5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we're go. And this is Jay. Welcome to the Galileo Podcast. This is number 13.
Lucky number 13.
Exactly, lucky number 13. And I'm here live with my good friend Brian, who's a fellow simmer on our game. You guys all know Brian. He plays our beloved slash controversial medical officer, Tula Vutalainen. So you guys also know Brian's he's kind of like an avid blogger, does a lot of writing for all of us on different websites. He posts a lot of things both on the Obsidian Fleet website and on the Ongoing Worlds blog, which is a larger blog for all of internet roleplay. And he's tackled a few topics before, a few topics that specifically address kind of like the style of creative writing that we do. And I think that's perfect for kind of what we're going to talk about today. I guess we'll just go straight into it, right, Brian?
Yeah.
We won't
just one note. I also play our wonderful new EDH. So for anyone who wants to do a JP with that, give me a shout.
Yeah, we got a new EBH, Emergency Babysitter Hologram, I think is what the acronym stands for.
Yeah.
Again, that's a questionable character.
Well, that's what happens when Tula gets to design a character. It doesn't end well.
Yeah, well, it never ends well, does it?
No.
Alright, so, let's get right into it. Our topic for today is, I think it's actually a great topic. It's one of the more intricate nuances of the simming world. And I think this applies to not only writers who do kind of our style of written roleplay, but also COs and game masters, as well as all those people who are above it. Kind of the administrators of, fleet politics and all that stuff. We're going to be talking today about the difference between being a good writer and being a good role player. And I think a lot of the times people don't realize there is a difference between the two. They kind of think of those two, adjectives as being synonymous with each other.
Yeah.
And they don't really understand that there is actually a complete and separate difference between them, and they absolutely ultimately affect any simulation that those people are on. I guess to get started, let's talk about, we'll address one first. We'll talk about what it means to be a good writer, and then we'll talk about what it means to be a good simmer and role player, and then we'll kind of compare and contrast the two. And then we'll also talk about, most importantly, why sometimes people who are good writers are not great role players. Which I think is kind of the heart and soul of this conversation. So let's get started, man. Brian, we're going to start out first. What, in your mind, makes a good writer?
I think just someone who writes out writing that's technically correct, and which is something that is interesting, that people, want to read. Not just technically correct, but like also kind of vivid writing, describes the scene, describe what's going on very well, describes what their character is thinking, what their character is saying. And the technical aspect of it, that's something that's not that hard to learn. Anyone can learn it, and if you don't know it, you can run your post through a spell check in Microsoft Word and get pretty close. I think the quality of writing is something that's a little bit harder to learn, takes a little bit more practice.
Now, is this kind of like the technical side of writing that you're talking about? Kind of like for example, the technical precision that involves wordplay. So, for example, things like like an enriched vocabulary. A good sense of sentence structure, a good flow of dialogue, and I remember you were saying, that whole technical aspect. Like, does that mean necessarily Star Trek tech? Kind of having it apply to the genre when you're writing, and having your references to certain types of technology, certain species, all different things, make it make sense. Or do you think it's kind of a combination of all that? Kind of what is it that you look for, and what you would define as being a good writer?
Well, I mean, I think first off, spelling and grammar is pretty obvious. If you're not really there on spelling and grammar, that's very distracting as a reader. You can see a lot of, and it also kind of shows that it sometimes shows like a lack of caring almost, when just a simple reread or running it through a spell check could pick up these errors and fix it. But I think also it has to do with things like, sentence flow structure, paragraph flow structure, being, describing things vividly. And, I'll admit, like, I'm not the best writer in, like, the simming universe. I think I'm all right, but, I sometimes see other people's writing, and I'm like, I don't know if I can write that good. That they really describe the scene really well there, which is also awkward because I'm an instructor in Obsidian Fleet Academy, and sometimes I get the cadet who really doesn't need to go through academy, so I gotta up my game on that one. But I think, like, as for Star Trek technical stuff, I think that's kind of, the thing is, that's the kind of thing that, like, only a very small portion of the readership is going to notice. Like, like the guy who goes, well, in episode 53, blah, blah, that's something I think we all need to just be a little chill about.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. Now, what would you say to those people who have actually studied different types of Star Trek technology, and they've actually looked through, they take the time to look through on Memory Alpha, like the different engineering tools, look at all their different purposes. They actually use the correct tools, access the correct consoles, and put the effort into creating the proper type of technobabble to the point where it makes sense. Obviously that's something that not everybody is interested in, but for those people who do decide to do it, is that something that you kind of get bonus points to?
Yeah, well, does any of the technobabble ever really make sense? I can just reverse the polarity on the anti-tachyons and save the ship most of the time, right? But I do think using using references from things like Memory Alpha, Memory Beta, that kind of stuff is good. I just think we shouldn't be jumping on each other's back. If somebody says, oh, I'm going to be repairing the isolinear circuitry, we shouldn't say, well, we use bioneural gel packs. Your character doesn't know that, you idiot. That kind of thing. I think we should just kind of let that kind of stuff slide.
If they don't know that, then they are idiots, right?
Well, if...
Oh, I'm just playing, man.
Yeah, that would be hard because I play a medical character and I move heavy boxes for a living, so that's not going to end well.
Yeah, well, and you kind of do like Galileo, where we have a hybrid of the two. We kind of, our starship had originally just regular isolinear circuitry, but we've also been upgraded over the past couple of years to incorporate bioneural gel packs, so we actually run both of it, which kind of gives our engineering guys a bit of flexibility and all that stuff. But I think the fact that the difference between the two says volumes. That's kind of what I'm getting at when I talk about technical stuff. It's like, if that's a really basic example, but it means a lot in Star Trek because each of them are well defined within the Star Trek universe. Each of them have different functions and are very different entities. So for, let's say, you have an engineering player who doesn't really know the difference between the two, and then just starts kind of mix and match them all the time. I mean, it's gonna confuse someone like me and you, right? A little bit. And there's
Well,
also gonna be other writers who are out there who are gonna be like, oh, hey, this doesn't quite make sense, Yeah, you might chalk it up to just that technobabble, but at the same time, it's kind of like that is the universe that we play in, and
yeah.
you have to have some degree of knowledge of what you're doing in the field that you're playing, in the department that you're playing, to be able to write it successfully.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, I think that first off, like I'm one of those guys who like I look at the specs to my the specs page on my ship, and my eyes just immediately glaze over. I don't know. I'm not really into the technical stuff. I'm more into the stories, right? And I think sometimes sometimes maybe you can help those people improve a little bit or explain it to them. Like, I think the worst situation in being a really bad player would be, for example, say, you know what, I'm going to reverse the polarity on the Bassard collectors and do this and shoot off my tachyon beam. A really bad player would be somebody who turns around and has his character say something who says, well, in episode 53 it doesn't create tachyon beams, it creates polaron beams, and really picks that out and has their character saying, well, sir, you're gonna blow up the ship if you do that, you idiot. I think we need to. I think as players we need to be a little forgiving about technical mistakes and try to help each other out with them, rather than try to pounce on each other and punish each other on technical mistakes. Because I've played with at least one or two people who've kind of done that, and that wasn't a whole lot of fun.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point, man. I mean, there's kind of as much as we all want to stay within the Trek universe and kind of write everything to the hilt, there's also a certain level of, I guess, what's the word for it? I guess forgiveness that we should have, right? For our fellow writers, for not necessarily picking up on the most intricate of technical details, and not kind of calling them out on it, live, in public. And I think it's kind of that acceptance, at least for me, kind of that acceptance that everybody has different knowledge levels of Trek, and different writing styles, and trying to get all that to work together while also letting everybody kind of understand what's going on in the post when you have the finished product. I think that's kind of one of the beauties of what we do here with our written roleplay.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think I think it covers some great aspects, of what it actually means to be a good writer. And here on Galileo, we've had writers come from different backgrounds, like Battlestar Galactica, Stargate, a lot of the different major sci-fi backgrounds, Babylon 5, things like that. And for some of them, it's been an adjustment to kind of pick up the Star Trek technology and all that stuff, and kind of the culture and the way it works, depending on how many episodes it actually had a chance to see. So, it's kind of one of those things where we want to provide the best atmosphere for our fellow writers to learn in. It's one of those things where they might not be 100% familiar with all the technobabble that we're putting out, but it's something that hopefully that we could teach them and that they can learn through a little bit of out of character research, kind of looking things up before they post about it. I think as long as everybody's on that same page, and as long as someone just doesn't say, oh yeah, whatever, this is just all just technobabble, it doesn't matter what I write, as long as they actually take a little bit of time and put in the effort to kind of write about what they're posting and research it and know the different things, then I think I think they'll be fantastic writers.
Yeah. I mean, I think the one other thing with that is also being a player, being a good player is one of the important things there is asking yourself, why something can work rather than why something can't. I mean, you see a lot of people talking about technical stuff, and it's all, I don't know, a lot of the times it goes down to you can't do this because of this. Because I saw this in episode 37 or blah, blah, blah. when really when we're doing a collaborative writing thing, we should, we have this immense creativity, and we should try to focus on using it to explain why we can do awesome things rather than why we can't.
Right. I actually think what we're talking about now kind of segues into kind of what makes a good simmer. So we just kind of took a minute. We talked about the qualities that we thought would make a good writer, you know. But I think a lot of things that we mentioned kind of drifted into the category of actually being a good role player and being a good simmer, and especially some of the things you just mentioned just now, Brian. So why don't you take the lead on this? Why don't you tell us what you think makes a good simmer and a good role player? And you could touch on some of those same things that you just said, because I think they're completely relevant.
Yeah, I mean, I think first off, I'm gonna give a shout out to one of my favorite articles on the entire internet. If you go to a site called Look Robot, there's an article called 11 Ways to Be a Better Role Player. I think everyone, no matter, like, it's intended for tabletop role playing, but there's enough similarities with simming that I think everyone should read that article. No matter what whether you're simming or playing Dungeon World, D&D, Pathfinder, whatever system, whatever game world, it's a really good article that people should really read. And I think being a good player, I think some of the most important things are to basically work with each other to try to advance the story and try to make the story cool and interesting. And I think that's basically key. Almost everything falls into that kind of thing, right? For example, I like to use the example of, say you have an Andorian and a Tellarite. And Andorians and Tellarites hate each other, right? We all know that. So you could have them either sit on opposite sides of the bar and ignore each other, because that's what my character would do. I wouldn't talk to a filthy Tellarite, and the other guy's character wouldn't talk to a stuck-up Andorian. Or you can work together and find a way to force them together and have these two very different characters who probably don't like each other very much go through some kind of experiences together and get to know each other. I mean, that's basically the plot to pretty much every cop movie ever made. You know what I mean?
Well, and that's the essence of roleplay, right? To get characters interacting and to write fun, interesting stories. Because let's be honest, if everyone's just going to sit at their corner of the bar or their certain table and they're not going to interact with each other, you can't really have proper roleplay.
Yeah.
Without, because you have no interaction between the characters. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I think one of the
I agree absolutely
things,
with that. Yeah.
I think one of the important things there too, and this is like sort of some of my advice that gets some of the old school style role players a little up in arms whenever I talk about it, is I think sometimes it's better to kind of step out of your character and ask yourself what would be good for the story, and then go with that. For example, I can think of decisions that I've made where I've maybe it's not exactly what my character would do, but I can kind of step out of my character, say, you know what, it would be great for the story if I did this, and then I can use my creativity to think, okay, this might not be what you think Tula would do at first glance, but maybe I can think of a reason why she would do that and justify it that way. And I think stepping out of your character and looking at the story is one of the things that I think separates good role players from great role players.
Yeah. Actually, I think that's a great point. Unfortunately, I don't want to get too much into it, just because I think that's a whole thing for a whole nother podcast. That's a pretty loaded, loaded topic. When you're kind of I guess like more or less what you're kind of advocating is the ability to uh, forego playing your character to the hill for the sake of the story. And I think on any simulation you get, it's going to be a little bit of a controversial topic. You're going to have people who agree, people who don't agree. But it's very interesting. I feel like it's very interesting, and like I said, man, I think that's just like I think it's great you brought that up, but I think that's um, ultimately something that we should talk about completely separate. Just because it's such a loaded topic, and it has so many positive points to it. But I do agree. I think you're kind of talking about some of the basic elements of being a role player.
Yeah.
Versus being a writer, where it's like as a role player, you want to do what's best for the story. Like you want to help cultivate the story of the game that you're on.
Yeah.
And however you think, or however you feel that you could do that in the best possible manner, it's kind of well, not necessarily obligation, but it's kind of your. It's kind of, well, I guess it is, right? It is kind of an obligation. Being a role player on a certain simulation or a certain game, whether it's tabletop, online, it's kind of your obligation as a player to contribute to the greater story and to do the best that you can with your character to try and cultivate a good story.
Yeah.
And so I think when we're talking about actually being a player aboard a sim, once we get past all the, kind of what makes a good writer stuff, we might have players who don't necessarily have the strongest spelling or grammar, or they don't necessarily give the strongest insight into their characters, or they don't have the richest vocabulary, or they don't have, the strongest knowledge of Trek. Or maybe their dialogue just doesn't flow that well. Maybe they just don't have a lot of experience with writing in general. But that doesn't mean that they can't be great role players.
Oh yeah.
That doesn't mean that they can't contribute to the story. That doesn't mean that they can't put in the effort and write with others and kind of do what they can to play their character within the confines of the story around them. You see what I'm saying? So I think for me, I've always felt that a good role player is one who tries to work with what they have, with their skill ability, regardless of what it may be, and work with the character that they've created, and play their character as true as they can, and more specifically, to write their character within the confines of the mission or the post or whatever else is going on around them, as realistically as they can. So to kind of, obviously the whole point of this is to give other people, other readers, other players, other prospective players, a chance to kind of read about their character and see what their character is actually like, and see how their character responds to different types of situations. Because that's really the essence of what we're doing here at Star Trek. We're all on an adventure, dude. We're trekking through space, man.
Yeah.
And we're going to be encountering all types of different shit. Some of it's good, some of it's bad, and in order for us to kind of get that real feel of the series, and kind of emulate kind of Gene Roddenberry's kind of whole Star Trek ideals, we have to actually explore our characters, because he was a big advocate of not only exploration of space, exploration of the cosmos, but exploration of ourselves and of individual, and of kind of like that inner exploration, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's it's a 50-50, man. That's half the element of Star Trek, in my opinion, is actually exploring your character. As much as we explore our adventures, on the outside, the physical, the metaphysical, whatever it may be, getting that personal exploration, kind of getting on that next level, is kind of what really makes Star Trek, and that's the difference between Star Trek and Star Wars. Man, I mean, you don't see inner exploration of characters in Star Wars. You don't see that shit in Babylon 5. You don't see it in Stargate. That's what makes Star Trek unique, man. Star Trek pushes the boundaries. The best Star Trek episodes, you look at Measure of a Man, where they have seven people sitting around in one room in a briefing room. It was just all dialogue. All dialogue. That's what it was, and it was the best episode ever because it touched on.
I'm gonna have to give a shout out to that Deep Space Nine one that I like.
Oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, the one with the Bajoran.
The Cardassian pretending to be another Cardassian, pretending to be another Cardassian.
It was the
filing clerk pretending to be a war criminal, pretending to be a filing clerk.
Yeah, it was like the triple subterfuge.
Yeah.
But it's things like that though, you know. That's the type of thing that you don't see in any other sci-fi series, and that's what makes Star Trek unique.
Yeah.
And so those are the things that when we actually get into Star Trek, when we actually start writing our stories, those are the things that really make a difference. They really, really make an impact. And those are the things that beyond just the regular technical writing skill, how well you're able to play your character, those are the things that make someone a good role player if they can recognize those concepts and be able to explore them. In my opinion.
Yeah, I think we're kind of getting on the touching on one of the things that I've kind of touched on a lot in my writings, and you know, it may be a semantic argument almost, but like I feel almost that like there's almost two ideas of how to be a good player. And, you know, not saying everybody falls into one or the other, because it could be like kind of a spectrum type thing, but I think there's kind of a very like old school idea that comes from words like simulation and sim and role playing, as in playing a role, where you think of your character as something constant, you know, put in a situation, let's run the simulation and see what happens. And then there's kind of, you know, my idea where I think of, you know, where I focus more on like collaborative storytelling and trying to figure out, you know, how can we work together to create a good story. I mean, I think there's a good point, you know, in this 11 Ways article that I really love. The author at the end, he says, you know, something that I fully agree with, which is do what's best for the game, do what's best for the story. Be active, be positive, be interesting, change things, and if you can't walk away at the end of the night with a good memory and with something that you can talk about, then everyone at the table has failed. And I think that's something that, you know, I think that's something that is worth thinking about when we're doing our writing and figuring out what our characters might do in the story.
Wow. Yeah, that's the most excellent quote. I really like that. Yeah. I'm gonna adopt that. But yeah, I mean, he's absolutely right. You know, I think a lot of us sometimes get admittedly a bit protective of our characters, and you know, because either we've been playing them for so long, or we're just kind of habituated in that certain type of way.
Yeah.
And we don't, you know, we're so concerned with playing our characters and doing what we want with our characters and developing our own characters that we don't necessarily pay as much attention to kind of the larger things that are going around us on the game.
Yeah.
You know, we don't necessarily put in as much effort into cultivating the main plot in the story as we do with cultivating our own characters' subplots and things that we are really interested in for our own character. You know, and kind of, I think when it gets to that point, then that's turning into a little bit of a selfish aspect of RPG, you know, because it's kind of like you're not using the game as a platform for advancing the game. You're using the game as a platform for advancing your own character.
Yeah. Which
is fundamentally self-serving. And it's just not, it doesn't contribute. It doesn't contribute to any of the other writers in their writing. It doesn't really contribute to kind of the whole theme of collaborative and collective role-playing, I feel, in my opinion. And it's something that, I mean, I think we've all, you know, I've raised my own hand. I think we've all been guilty of that at some point.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's no shame in that. Life and role playing in general is just all about. It's a learning experience. You know, we kind of learn what works, what doesn't work, and there's no shame in having made past mistakes. But I think what makes a good role player is recognizing those mistakes, recognizing when you kind of focus only on your own character, or when you're interested in nothing else but your own character, um, or interested in different subplots, but ignore other characters around you and the things that other people are trying to do on the sim as well. And I think if you're able to recognize those things, recognize those flaws, I mean, we all have flaws. We're all human. That's our nature. Nobody's perfect. Uh, I'm not trying to. I just want to say a disclaimer. I'm not trying to lecture anybody or tell them, I'm fantastic. I might be a GM. You might be a GM. Marcus, I know Marcus is here with us. He's a GM as well. And none of us are perfect. We're all trying to do our best. We're all trying to learn and be the best role players that we can. And so there's no harm in admitting that we might have made some mistakes here and there. But I think those of us who could recognize that the mistakes that we've made and then learn from them, I think that's what really makes it true. That not only makes a great person in general, but that makes a great role player. So, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, man. That was the most excellent point.
Yeah. And I think there's one other thing that I think is really important to being a great player, and this going back to that list of 11 ways. The first item on that list is do stuff. I find one of the funny things I find is, in both my tabletop games and on the Portland, which I run in Obsidian Fleet, I get a lot of new players. Maybe not totally new. Not new players isn't the right word, but players who are new to my game, who are used to playing in other people's games, and especially like in things like, especially in tabletop role playing, especially when I run Dungeon World games at like conventions and stuff, I get players who are new to my games, and they're always unsure of themselves at the start. Like they're always like, how much freedom do I have? Can I do this? If I do this, am I going to ruin your story? And the one thing that I always reply to them with is, don't worry about that. The only way we can ruin this story is to make it boring. If you got an awesome idea, do it. And I think that's something that makes a really good player, because one of my favorite players on my sim, Tierlai, my chief diplomatic officer, is an instigator in the best possible way, because Tierlai's always bringing something interesting, maybe something out of left field from time to time, but always bringing something interesting to the story and advancing the story in really cool and interesting ways and doing awesome stuff.
Oh, so an out of character instigator.
Yeah, well, like the character is like an instigator.
Or maybe both in character and out of character instigator.
Yeah, maybe. Well, you know what I mean. Like this character will, do cool stuff. Like, this is the character that's going to piss off the Orion pirates and send 3 like Orion cruisers after you, and that's gonna make the story a lot more interesting.
Right. I actually think it's good that you mentioned that, because every sim that you're on, or that's on the internet, has different game masters.
Yeah.
And each of those game masters runs their sims differently. There's no universal code in simming for a certain way that things should be run. And a lot of times it's at the discretion of the CEO as to how they prefer to run their stories. And this is actually one of the most ambiguous aspects of simming, and one of the things a lot of CEOs can't, especially new ones, they don't really grasp it. They really don't understand kind of what the ratio should be to the amount of control they have over the story versus the amount of control that their players have over the story. And I think, Brian, what you said, where your player asked, he actually asked ahead of time and said, hey, what types of things am I able to do on this game, and kind of like what's taboo. I think that alone shows a great deal of maturity, because, for example, if, let's say the same characters on Galileo, we're running a scripted mission where we have certain events, certain main plot points that need to happen and to progress through a certain order in order for our story to unfold. Right now, if we have someone who's throwing in curveballs left and right and kind of just doing their own thing that doesn't conform to the story, there's going to be a huge problem.
Oh yeah.
And uh, it's uh, it's one of those things where it'll not only confuse the GMs but the other players around them, and it can make for just I don't know. It could take a structured story and it could just turn it all upside down and create a lot of confusion. So um,
Yeah.
the fact that the player was asking about it beforehand and kind of seeing how much freedom they had, I think spoke volumes about
Yeah.
their maturity. So I just came right away and started doing whatever they wanted.
Yeah.
you
Oh
know,
yeah, definitely. But
yeah. So the fact that they were mature enough and experienced enough to kind of ask the correct questions, kind of kind of put out their whiskers, kind of feel around to see what they can and can't get away with. I think it's great.
yeah.
And Marcus here, Marcus brings up a great point. He says, "You shouldn't build your mission so rigidly that one post unfolds it
Yeah.
within reason." And that's absolutely correct.
Yeah.
And I think that's also a great point. There's a lot of onus on the game masters, um, and kind of us as the command staff, where we have to create. Excuse me. We have to create missions. At least I feel like we have to create missions where we can allow for a whole variety of possibilities to happen. It's kind of like at least the way I see it is that it's like let's say I want to make a mission with a certain I want to create the background for a mission, but I also want to have a certain end game for the mission. And this is different because some COs create missions without any end game, and they just want their players to create the end game themselves.
Yeah.
But for me, I like to create a mission and then create an end game, and kind of let everybody figure out how it works in between. Which I found in my experience has been a lot of fun for all of our players.
Yeah.
I mean, in that creation process, there's no way that I would make certain posts where things absolutely have to happen a certain type of way because that would limit the creativity of a lot of the players.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's nothing wrong with having something scripted and having something where you want things to happen a certain way, or you want a certain end game, or saying something like, "Hey guys, you know what? We can do whatever, but I'd like this guy to escape because I think he'd be a cool recurring villain," kind of deal. There's nothing wrong with doing stuff like that, but you got to be honest with your players about it. I mean, one of the worst tabletop role-playing sessions I ever had was a session where there was this bad guy called the Black Hood, and we spent the entire session trying to hunt him down and catch him, because he did something. I forget what he did. Maybe he tried to kill us or something. And so we spend this entire session trying to hunt him down, but at every turn, the DM blocks us. So we'll capture one of his henchmen and start interrogating him, and the henchman's going to get shot with a blowgun dart and die. So we're going to chase after the guy with the blowgun and beat him up and interrogate him, and he's going to take a cyanide pill. And at the end of the session, I'm just so frustrated, and I say to the GM, "You know what? You're blocking me every way. What's going on here?" And he says, "Oh, well, you're not supposed to get to the Black Hood until the third act. We're only in the first act, so..."
And oh boy! And none of that was explained ahead of time, was it?
Yeah, you could have told me 3 hours ago, and I'd have been cool with it, and I'd had my character go do something else. But I think that's an example of how it's okay to have something structured and scripted, and you just got to be honest with your players about that. If things have to happen a certain way, you can be honest with your players about that and say, "Hey, I'd like things to go this way, for this little bit." And I think when you try to do kind of the underhanded thing of trying to railroad them towards a certain conclusion, but try to almost deceive them as though they don't, kind of trying to control things without looking like you're trying to control things. I think that's where a lot of DMs get into a lot of trouble and cause a lot of problems for themselves.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know, man, because I consider myself the master of deception for our missions. But no, I completely agree, man. I think all of us have different styles. Some of it works, some of it doesn't work. It's really all up to the personality of the GM and how much they explain to their players, how much they keep their players informed, and kind of what type of relationship they have with their players. Because the players are obviously the foundation of the Sims, so it's like you want to keep them happy, you want to keep them entertained, and I'll be honest, and I'll say that players love suspense. They
Yeah.
love not knowing what's going to happen next. They love that feeling that you're actually creating a new adventure and that every action that you take matters because you don't know what's going to be right around the corner. I can say that from experience. So I think I don't know, there's just a certain element to each GM's style of managing Sims, managing stories, and there's no one correct style. All of them work, and it all depends on your crew and how your crew prefers for things to unfold. Um, uh,
Yeah.
Marcus here says absolutely. He says his best mission was one where he kept the crew on edge on the fate of the captain, uh, killing him cryptically and bringing him back subtly over multiple posts. And that's a great example, Marcus. That's perfect. Because it's that type of thing. It's like you don't really know. Is the captain dead? Is Captain not dead? Are we bringing him back? Is he gonna actually survive the whole bringing back process? It's like you never really know. So yeah, it's just exactly, Marcus. Yeah, keeping people on edge, keeping them feeling suspenseful, just keeping them excited. I think is like the coolest thing. I think it's the best job we could do as GMs. It's kind of like, at least for me, my goal is to make sure that every time one of my players logs in, they feel excited and they have something to look forward to with a new tag. And that's a lot. It's a lot easier said than done. But it's. If you could pull it off, I think it's fantastic. So. So now let's get into the final segment here, and this is the final and most important segment of the podcast. So we've already talked about what we think makes a good writer, correct?
Yeah.
And we've talked about what we think makes a good role player, correct?
Yeah.
All right. Now, unfortunately, in the semi world, oftentimes, well, not oftentimes, but sometimes. Actually, no. I will say oftentimes. I'll be completely honest, and I'll say that oftentimes
Yeah.
good writers don't make good simmers.
Yeah.
Now, I'll repeat that. So there's no ambiguity whatsoever. In my experience, oftentimes good writers, great writers, don't make good simmers, and they don't make good role players. And I think there's a few reasons for that. I think some of those reasons involve the things that we were talking about before. So, Brian, I'll turn it over to you first. I'm sure you've encountered this phenomenon. I think every GM has before.
Yeah.
It's a really unpleasant one. It's really awful to deal with. It's something that never makes any of us feel good as game masters, but it's something that we've kind of learned is part of the simming world. And I think for those of us who are experienced, we've kind of learned to identify it. And but I think personally, I've never really understood what the underlying reason was behind why that happens. So, Brian, enlighten us, man. What do you feel? Why is it that some of the best writers out there don't make great role players?
Well, I think it's a lot of reasons, and I know, I've had that same experience too. You can see a player's application, and they have a bio and a sample post that's all impeccably written. It's long, it's detailed, it's everything, and then they turn out to be not the best player. Which you can't really tell because. Where in the application they're just asking for a bio and a sample post, so all you can see is their writing skills, and you can't really see them interact with the other players. But I think there's a few reasons for it. I think there's the whole kind of frustrated novelist stereotype. where somebody who is a great writer will have, very specific ideas about what they want to write, and are kind of using simming as a way to do that. So they have, very specific ideas about things like, their character that they spent, wrote a 20,000 word bio for or something.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but lack of flexibility. Would you say that counts?
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's exactly what
it.
Marcus just said. So it looks like you and him are on the same page.
Yeah, and I think also lots of writers are egotists too, so that doesn't help.
Yeah,
And
and this
especially
is
if you're,
actually I'm glad you brought that up because I I'm kind of one of a relatively newer written roleplay players in Obsidian Fleet compared to some of the other people who've been around there for um, for 10 plus years, or been doing it since they were teenagers. I've only been doing written roleplay for I think 4 years, 5 years now.
Yeah.
And I did it on and off. I've only been in Obsidian Fleet maybe 4 years, I think. So, I'm not like the most experienced, but I just have to wonder kind of like what. I don't know. I guess what's the best way to put it? What is it about? Oh man, I gotta preface this again. I'm really sorry, man. I've heard about this phenomenon. They call it the writer's ego.
Yeah.
But I had never really understood exactly what it is or why it occurs.
Yeah.
And I never really believed that it existed because I thought it was just, I thought it was an intangible, something that had no, there was no proof of existence, no actual certifiable reason for it to exist. But in my experiences, in my short experiences here, I've noticed that it is definitely a real thing. It is definitely a real phenomenon. And it creates a lot of friction between certain writers. And oftentimes when it occurs, it occurs with good writers. And so, I don't know, Brian, Marcus, can you guys tell me, first of all, what the writer's ego is? Second of all, why it exists? And third of all, why do we have to deal with it when we're trying to do collaborative written roleplay?
Well, we unfortunately have to deal with it because we, from time to time, interact with some people who have huge ego problems. So we have to deal with it there. It's funny. Like I've never thought about it that hard, but I've actually once caught myself kind of doing that. I saw a player on a sim that I'm on who wasn't the best at spelling and grammar, and was initially getting kind of frustrated with the posts that she was producing, because I'm like, oh my god, learn some syntax. But then I kind of step back from that a little bit, and I see like, hey, wait a minute. She's one of the most active players on the sim. She's posting all the time. She's moving the story forward. Her character's doing interesting stuff. She's actually a good player.
Yeah. And so what did... I don't know, I mean, did you have a sense of kind of like superiority over her or something because you wrote better, like because your spelling and grammar were better, or like, I mean, how does that work? I don't. It's just a weird concept to me. I'm not really familiar with it. So I mean, if you guys can kind of enlighten for me, it would be much appreciated. Because I mean, it is a problem that we deal with in simming, and if we can't talk about the problem and understand the problem, then we have no hope of combating it and of fixing it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, I don't know, I'm just thinking here, but I think, I think writers often feel that they're deserving of an audience, that they, produce good work and that's deserving of an audience, and they want people to read it and appreciate it. And I think that in some cases goes to people's heads a little bit. Especially in cases where they think they are deserving of a larger audience than they are actually getting, and hence end up, simming instead of writing award-winning novels.
Yeah. Um, Galileo actually had a couple published authors on board about 6 months after we first started. They found us through, I think, pbem.com, one of the
Oh
play-by-email listings. And it was really nice. It was a pleasure to have them on board. Their writing was superb. It was fantastic. It kicked my ass. Like I remember trying to do JPs with them, and I was like sweating every time I did a tag, struggling to keep pace with them. Trying to, and it was great because they pushed my writing to be better because they were such great writers themselves. So I put so much effort and time into my writing to try and keep up with them, and in turn that made me a good writer. And I don't think I ever experienced that whole writer's ego thing. They were actually very humble about everything. They're actually pretty cool. But I'd say about a couple months later, we had a player come on board who wasn't as good of a writer, who was just another amateur writer like all of us are. And she posted a lot, and she did a lot of writing, but she had an ego. And I remember talking to her once on Instant Messenger, and I said, yeah, I was like, we got a bunch of different writers. Some of them are kind of, um, some of them aren't the strongest with the English language. Some of them are pretty good. I was like, but everybody here's, we're all great. And she proceeded to rank all of our writers according to her categories.
I take it she was number one?
Well, yeah, absolutely, yeah. She was in the elite category or whatever, or something like that she described, which is like the best writers that there are out there. And then she ranked people who were like second best, and she put me in that category. People who like write a lot but aren't like, they don't tell as good stories as other people. And she kept proceeding to rank all these people, and I just remember at that point I was like, what? I was like, excuse me? I was like, you really is that? I mean, first of all, I was like, why would you? Yeah, first of all, if you're doing collaborative written roleplay, why would you even create a ranking like that in the first place? Because number one, it makes no difference. Number two, it's so egotistical that it's beyond me. And also at the same time, I was like, you realize you're talking to the game, to the game master of Galileo right now, right? And she just didn't get it, dude. She didn't get it. It didn't click in her head. She just, I don't know how to describe it. It was just how she was, and she was competitive. That's another thing. She was competitive. She posted a lot. She posted more than I think most of the players on her sim did. But she didn't understand that it's not about how many posts that she posts.
Yeah.
It's about how good of a player you are and how much you contribute to the community.
Yeah.
So you could have one player who posts. If I remember, one month she posted 20-something posts. Half of them were just with one other person.
Yeah.
That's not contributing to the community.
Yeah.
So her mind was skewed. She had her own opinion of kind of what was going on. She wasn't really in touch with reality. Wasn't a good role player. She was a decent writer. She wasn't a great writer. I'll put it that way. She thought of herself a lot better than what she actually was. And I think the fact that once you actually start trying to rank other writers and put them in different categories, I think that's a serious kind of dysfunctional thought train,
Yeah.
But that happens. It happens. You have writers who are like that, and they're very detrimental to a game. And those are usually writers who are self-serving, and they write stories. Yeah, I think you'll notice that they write stories that are all about themselves.
Yeah.
And
definitely.
Some of them go on to be GMs. You'll notice on their sims they write stories about. They write a whole mission about their own characters.
Yeah.
They won't include anybody else. It's all self-serving.
Yeah.
And those are the people who create bad role players.
Yeah.
And those are people who are good writers but bad role players.
Yeah.
That's my personal story, man. Do you have anything that happened like that ever?
Well, I can think of I can think of a couple of players who were good writers but not great role players, people who made things all about themselves. I don't know if I want to name names here because they might be listening, but
No, no, you don't need to name names, but
I think,
go
yeah.
talk about it, man. Talk about it.
Well, I mean, like, for example, I once dealt with a player a while back who had, I think he was also on Galileo, but he was notoriously difficult to get along with, and whenever he had this weird thing where he took the idea of I see actions equals I see consequences to some bizarre extreme where it's like I see actions equals I'm going to take it on myself to punish you for your stupidity because you didn't write things as realistic or as good as I think you should have. And he was a problem. Unfortunately, it wasn't handled well. But I think there was a that was definitely an example of someone who was a good writer but a horrible role player. Just because he couldn't get along with people and he would constantly try to make other characters, look bad, constantly calling people out on like little tiny technical mistakes or things like that, or if they didn't use what he thought was the best tactic or something, he'd call them out on that, and it was unpleasant even being on the same sim as him, and even though he was like his posts were pretty good, but he was he wasn't exactly the greatest person in the world. And I think at the end of the day, collaborative writing, role playing with people, is a much, much, much different skill than writing fan fiction by yourself. And I think, to be honest, I think there's some people out there who would probably be better off and would probably be better writing their own little fanfic that revolves all around their characters than writing with other people and trying to write a story with other people, because it's just two completely different skills, two completely different things, and self-centered egotists aren't very good players. But yeah, I mean, definitely there have been some players who aren't some writers, some really good writers who aren't the great players, but conversely, there's some people who are both, and those people are real gems to have on your sim, especially when they're really good players, really getting involved with lots of people, tagging lots of people, starting JPs left, right, and center, this sort of thing. There are some people who are really, really good at both, and those are, I think, some of the best players out there. People who are helpful, who are good writers, and also good players. But definitely there are, and there's also a lot of people who aren't very good writers but are great players, and I am way more willing to overlook that if, say somebody who English isn't their first language, they struggle with grammar and spelling and something, but they're also constantly getting other players involved, constantly tagging people, JPing with people, that kind of thing, constantly helping advance the story, and are, cool about being a little flexible with their characters, like I was saying earlier. Those people, I'd rather have somebody who makes spelling mistakes than somebody who is a massive egotist who can't get along with anyone else and who is a bad player. But definitely it's a problem, right? And it's something that we just have to deal with as GMs whenever it comes up. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the focus on things like applications and the academy and things like that. A lot of the focus on that is on writing skills and not uh, not not on skills as players. Um, and I got a question here from Marcus. What about players who have some sort of learning disorder and can't coherently write but end up on The Sims somehow? How do you deal with that? Well, I mean, that's a tricky one. I mean, the thing is, simming is a very, I think unfortunately there's also a lot of people within the simming community who probably need help and who kind of use simming as an outlet for that. And I'm a captain of an imaginary starship. I'm not a professional psychiatrist or professional guy who knows how to deal with learning disorders or anything like that. So I don't really know how to deal with all that. I mean, I haven't run into that problem yet. I've had maybe a couple things close to it, but I haven't really run into that problem yet myself. So I guess summing up, not always. A lot of times good writers aren't always good players, and that's something that we need to keep in mind. That's something that we need to focus on teaching people to be good players rather than just focus on teaching them to be good writers, because in my opinion I'd rather have one good player than 10 good writers who are bad players. Good players work. Thing is, with writers, a lot of times writers live a little bit of a solitary existence, with them and their computer or typewriter if they're that old school. They live a solitary existence writing by themselves, and some of them have writer's ego issues, and not always does a good writer end up being a good player once you actually start interacting and getting into the collaborative part of collaborative role-playing.
Yeah. That sounds good, man. I apologize. I took a head call real quick, so I missed a little bit of what you were saying recently. But Marcus actually just brought up a good point. I'm not sure if you addressed it, Brian, but I'll kind of read out what he asked. He says, what about players who have some sort of learning disorder and can't coherently write but end up on the sim, and how do we deal with that? And I think that's a great question, because we do have a lot of players, and by nature, being on the internet, we deal with a lot of people who might possibly have some sort of handicap in one way or another, whether it's a physical or mental handicap. But nonetheless, we always try to be inclusive and to try and bring those players aboard our sims to give them a good time, because that's what simming's all about, right? It's all about providing kind of a little bit of an escape from our real world to be able to kind of have a good time, and kind of escape whatever is going on in the real world and be able to get online and write some fun stories and kind of laugh and joke and have a smile on our face at the end of the day when we log offline off the sim, kind of like what you were saying earlier. And sometimes we do have players who aren't necessarily on, they're not, what's the best way to put this? They're not they're not on the same. They're not coming from the same type of background as we are. They've got some things going on that makes it a little bit harder for them to actually engage in the written roleplay aspect of what we try to do, and it's no fault of theirs, but it's just how it is. And we as COs and as game masters, we try to invite them into our environment and to kind of acclimate them to the sim and try and get them to assimilate into the culture. But I mean, sometimes it just doesn't work out. It's difficult, you know. It's really difficult, you know. It's one of those things where, you know, we could try our best and we could do whatever we can, but a lot of times when it doesn't work out, we end up just feeling kind of crappy because we don't know if we did anything wrong, or, you know, we're not really exactly sure kind of what, you know, what has transpired, or, you know, what we could have done differently, if that makes any sense. And
I mean, the other thing is the miracle of technology here. I mean, just because somebody's not great with written role play doesn't mean they can't, you know, do some role play. You know, do some like, you know, there's some programs out there you can play stuff like D&D and stuff like that online with people. You can get a good group there going. So,
so you're just giving up on them. You're telling
no, well, you know, if it don't work out,
go off and do a different type of thing.
Well, you know, if it doesn't work out, you know, if somebody just can't, you know, keep up with written role playing because of the writing, then there's other stuff out there for them to get the role playing without struggling with the writing.
Yeah, I think. I mean, if I'm completely honest, and this might sound a little bit harsh, but that what we all do at GMs is we try to run a written role play game, and we try to take care of all our players and have them in a environment where they can contribute to the posts around, you know, to the posts and to the different activity and to the stories that's all around them. And as much as we might try to make that happen, sometimes it just doesn't work out. Yeah. And I think there's, you know, if you end up having to deal with someone who is, you know, for whatever reason they end up being rude or mean or condescending to their fellow writers, then there's just really no place for that, regardless of what background they're coming from. And in that case, I think that other forms of role play are probably better suited for them. Yeah. Because, you know, ultimately, simming here is supposed to be a friendly, nurturing, and a fun environment. Like, we're all doing Star Trek fan fiction. You know, there's really absolutely no place whatsoever for any type of rudeness, any type of hostility, any type of negative feelings. Like, we all do this for fun. We all do this as a hobby. I personally have a no drama policy, a zero tolerance policy, if you want to say. But it's you know, I've met a lot of SEALs who also say they have a zero tolerance policy, but I have a legit zero tolerance policy. And Brian, I'm sure you've noticed this with me. Dude, I read your feedback on the
I thought that was anonymous.
On our student survey. Oh, it's anonymous, but I know who wrote it. I know you guys well enough. You absolutely do. Brian, you're absolutely right. I do not deal with drama well, and I have no shame in admitting that. I am not someone who puts a lot of time into drama. I won't try and explore it in depth. I literally see drama, and my phobia just kicks in, and I just tell everybody shut the hell up and end it right there and then, you know, because that's something that, number one, I don't deal with it well in real life, and I've never had any relationships where I've had a lot of drama, and if I do, those relationships quickly come to an end, whether it be with friends or girlfriends or whatever. And the same thing applies to the simming world here. You know, we're all here ultimately to have a great time and to have fun. And those people who, for some reason, can't get along or are just always nitpicking about something or creating problems or conflict within the crew, it's not only bad for myself to deal with, it's not only bad for their co-writers to deal with, it's bad for the sim overall to deal with. So personally, it's just something I avoid. You know, it's just something you know, everybody, you know, everybody's welcome to participate. Those who can participate and can do it successfully, they're always welcome. those people who struggle. You know, I mean no ill will towards them. I wish them the very best of luck in their future RPGing endeavors, but there's a time and a place for everybody, and sometimes a certain simulation might necessarily be the place for a certain person, and there's there's no shame in that. So
unfortunately,
just
sometimes it doesn't work out, and that's why. And for whatever reason too, you could have somebody who just gets busy or is going into a new chapter of their life where they don't have as much time for simming, and unfortunately sometimes it doesn't work out, and hopefully if it's not working out, the player recognizes that, but unfortunately as a GM, sometimes if it's not working out, you got to do what you got to do for the sim, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's our responsibility as CEOs to take care of our players, to take care collectively of our simulation, because that's what we're responsible for. We are accountable for our sims. We signed up to do a job as game master. When we signed up, we took on. And we did all this voluntarily. Like, keep in mind, like nobody forced us to do this. We voluntarily signed up to lead a group of fellow writers on their journeys through the Star Trek fan fiction world, right? And that's something I feel like a lot of CEOs don't always understand, But when you volunteer to do something like that, there's a certain amount of responsibility that's placed on your shoulders and a certain amount of accountability. And so you're accountable for your Sim's performance, for the stories that they create, for your activity, for the culture. Most importantly, the culture that you create within your sim. And so it's your job as a GM to create the best culture that you can for your sim, and to please all of your players. Like, you're literally at the service of your players. Like, everything I do on Galileo, I don't know about you, Brian, but everything I do on Galileo is for my players.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I mean, it's a selfless act. It's a selfless service that we do as GMs. We don't become GMs because we want to create these cool stories for our own characters. I know some GMs do, and their sims usually don't last long. Those of us who are successful and who run like yourself and I, we run simulations where we cater to our crew and we do things that we want our crew to have fun with. And so if we get any type of disturbance or anything that upsets that process, I mean, I don't know about you, man, but I have zero tolerance for that. And that's like I was saying earlier, man, 0 tolerance policy. And a lot of that starts with just basic recruiting. It starts with getting the right people on your sim in the first place. It starts with vetting your players when they apply, asking them to tell them a little bit about themselves. Kind of getting to know them a little bit and making sure that they're on board with your policies and your style of game management before you even accept them onto the sim. I think if someone could do that, then you can alleviate most of the problems that you have, especially these problems where you have people who are good writers but aren't necessarily great simmers. So, I mean, I've gotten a few great writing battles before, and then I've asked the person to tell me a little bit about themselves, and they've seemed a little bit off. And some of the answers that they've given me were kind of questionable, to the point where I'm thinking, well, I don't really think this person would be a great fit with our crew.
Yeah.
And if you know your crew well, you could get a pretty good idea of whether or not this new player is going to fit in with them.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I don't know, man. I mean, I guess that's all I have to say on the matter. I mean, is there anything we didn't cover? Any certain type of a writer or a player who's a good writer but isn't a good simmer? Or do you want to talk about drama queens for a minute? Or I mean, I think we kind of briefly touched on that, so I think we might.
I think that's a whole other subject of its own. That we can talk all night about that.
Drama queens and ragers, I think.
We'll just do like our next episode. It's just going to be a list of people we hate.
Oh yeah, the blacklist, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll do a blacklist for the next episode. We'll call everybody out.
Yeah. Call in some of our old nemesis.
All right, guys. Yeah, this has been the most excellent podcast. Thanks a lot, Brian,
You're welcome.
for participating. Yeah, so there you guys have it. We talked about kind of what we feel makes a good writer, what we feel makes a good simmer, kind of what the difference is between a good writer and a good simmer, and we also talked about why good writers sometimes don't make good simmers. We tried to be as specific as we could and give some examples from our history. So I hope you guys have taken away something from this podcast. It's a pleasure to broadcast with you guys tonight. For the Galileo Impulse, my name is Jay, and I'm here with Brian, and we'll see you guys next time. Adios.
Awesome.